Hey guys, tonight we're strapping on our virtual helmets, no, not for gaming, but for a journey back about 1,000 years, straight onto the deck of a Viking longship. Close your eyes for a second. You're standing on the Drekker, a fearsome dragon ship, slicing through the frigid, ink-black water somewhere between Norway and the shores of what will someday be called Iceland. Feel that sharp, metallic scent of the sea air? It's laced with a brutal cold that seems to bypass your clothes entirely and chill your very bones. The waves crash over the low gunwales, not as gentle spray, but as an icy, face-slapping assault. The wind isn't a breeze. It's a relentless, howling thief, trying to steal every last shred of warmth you possess. You clutch the rough, damp wood of the rail, the vibration of the enormous rhythmic oars shuddering through your arms. It's exhilarating, yes, but mostly it's just cold. Now, look around. You've been sailing for days, perhaps weeks, heading into the blinding grey dawn. You've got 50 other warriors huddled around you, all equally miserable and magnificent. But here's the reality check. The thing that would send a modern sailor straight into hypothermia within hours. There is no fire. There is no little stovepipe poking up from a cozy cabin. There is no radiant electric heat, no roaring brazier. There's just wood, water, wind, and you. And you probably won't survive this trip if you don't figure out the secret. The very core of our journey tonight is simple, yet profoundly mysterious. How did Vikings heat their ships on icy seas without fire? The historical fact that makes this so challenging is that Viking longships, particularly the swift Nars and longships used for raiding and exploring, were almost universally open-deck vessels. They were designed for speed, stability, and carrying capacity, not for comfortable, prolonged exposure in the Arctic. Their famous shallow drafts, a core mainstream historical fact, allowed them to beach quickly and navigate up rivers, but it also meant the deck was dangerously close to the freezing water, offering minimal internal volume for shelter. They didn't do cabins. They did canvas tents, maybe, but certainly not a permanent, insulated living space with a hearth. To burn an open fire on a wooden ship covered in flammable tar, especially one rocking violently in a northern storm, was a risk even these legendary risk-takers rarely considered. And when you look at the evidence, the remnants of hearths found on ships like the Oseberg or Gokstad are often small clay-lined boxes designed for cooking small meals when anchored, not for continuous heating during a sea voyage. It's a logistical nightmare waiting to become a burning pile of splinters, and frankly, a bit of a safety hazard even I, in this relaxed setting, have to gently warn you about. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you right now, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Maybe you're on the coast of California, enjoying a warm afternoon, or perhaps you're tucked up under a thick blanket in Scandinavia, listening to the rain. Either way, you're a long, long way from the Vikings' freezing predicament. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shiver, involuntarily. You feel the constant heavy spray of seawater clinging to the thick woolen coat you're wearing. It's a good coat, probably made from the finest, oily, water-repellent wool. But it is not magic. The most dangerous enemy isn't the cold itself, but the insidious dampness. Water conducts heat away from the body about 25 times faster than air. Once your clothes are saturated, your internal heat begins a rapid, terrifying spiral downward. The simple presence of the sea around you is a constant, terrifying, and overwhelming drain on your life force. You lean against the mast for a second, feeling the smooth, cold wood, and realize this whole ship is an enormous, high-efficiency heat sink, constantly pulling your body temperature toward the 0 degrees Celsius surrounding environment. It's tempting to romanticize this as pure tough guy endurance, but that's not historically accurate or sustainable. The Vikings were practical. They had a complex system, a series of layered thermal defenses that allowed them to cross the North Atlantic and even explore the Barents Sea. This system didn't involve a single, elegant solution, but 1,000 tiny adjustments, all working together. Consider this quirky tidbit. Many surviving Viking artifacts, especially from the later periods, feature intricately carved sledges and smaller boats within the longship burial sites. While these often had ceremonial purposes, They hint at a sophisticated approach to compartmentalizing resources and possibly even providing extra sheltered space for high-value items. Or, just maybe, the most unfortunate, or perhaps highest-ranking sailors. Historians still argue whether these small internal structures provided any meaningful thermal barrier or were simply status symbols, but they point to a constant quest for maximizing limited space. Whatever their function, they certainly weren't a furnace. The only furnace you have, for now, is the one inside your own body. And to keep that fire going, you need more than just good wool. You need a ship that works with you, not against you. And that brings us to the design itself. The wind still screams in your ears, a constant, high-pitched monotone that almost drowns out the slapping of the water against the hull. You shift your weight, trying to find a patch of deck where the spray hasn't collected, but it's a futile effort. Now, let's consider the machine you're on, the Longship. It wasn't just a vessel. It was an incredibly advanced piece of thermal technology, albeit one focused more on avoiding sinking than generating warmth. The Longship's famous construction method, the clinker-built hull, is a mainstream historical fact that becomes absolutely critical in this icy setting. Instead of butting the planks edge to edge, carvel construction, Viking shipbuilders overlapped the planks, riveting them together. You can actually feel the edge of the overlap near your foot, a slightly raised seam running the length of the ship. This overlapping creates a hull that's exceptionally flexible and surprisingly light. This flexibility is the key. When you hit a heavy wave, the ship gives a little, absorbing the shock, meaning the hull doesn't strain and crack as easily. Why is this a thermal defense? Because a flexible, watertight hull means less water ingress. And as we established in Section 1, water is your number one enemy. Keeping the bilge relatively dry means the wooden structure you're lying on isn't saturated, which keeps the ambient air slightly less humid and helps slow the conductive heat loss from your body to the wood. The other design element that works against you, yet makes the voyage possible, is the shallow draft. The ship barely sits in the water, only needing a meter or two of depth. This means it's faster and can navigate rivers, but it also means the freezing sea is constantly rushing right beneath your feet, often washing over the deck itself. It's a trade-off: speed and versatility for comfort and insulation. You're essentially sitting on a wooden raft with a giant sail, speeding across an oceanic ice bath. Maybe you brought a nice fluffy sweater, but the ocean doesn't care. So, where do you find a tiny pocket of defense? You might notice the spaces between the overlapping planks aren't just sealed with pitch and moss. They contain a thin cushion of trapped air. This pocket of air, constantly being massaged by the waves and the flexing hull, provides a fraction of insulation. It's minimal, but over a surface area the size of the whole ship, every little bit helps. It's a very early, accidental form of double glazing, only with wood and freezing water instead of glass and air. You think to yourself that whoever invented the modern thermos bottle should really be recognized as a late Viking hero. A quirky tidbit about the wood they used. Scandinavian shipbuilding favoured oak for the keel and strakes. Oak, being a dense wood, is naturally a decent insulator compared to metals or stone. But more importantly, the Vikings often used unseasoned or green wood. This green wood, while heavier initially, retains more natural oils and sap, which helped with water resistance and, perhaps counterintuitively, provided better structural integrity and flexibility than fully dried, brittle timber. It's like wearing a coat that's slightly damp with natural oils to repel the rain less than ideal, but better than a dry sponge. As you look at the mast towering above you, holding the enormous, square wool sail dark, stiff, and heavy with tar, you realize the mast isn't just a point of support. It's also a surprisingly large piece of wood, radiating heat away from the core of the ship. Historians still argue whether the internal ribs and framing timbers were primarily functional, or if their dense arrangement also served to segment the deck, potentially creating slightly less exposed nooks and crannies where men could huddle for protection from the wind. It's likely they were simply structural, but on a 30-meter-long ship, you grab any shelter you can find. Remember that dampness we talked about? Well, the Longship design offers a partial solution, not from heat but from drainage. The open nature of the deck, coupled with the Longship's ability to ride over the waves, rather than through them like heavier ships, means that the water that does splash onto the deck generally runs right off, or at least collects in the narrow bilge space where it's less likely to soak your bedding and gear constantly. If you were on a deep, flat-bottomed vessel, the water would pool and stagnate on deck, creating a perpetually wet environment. The Viking Longship is a beautifully designed drain, constantly shedding the liquid enemy. You find yourself instinctively pulling your arms into your sleeves and hunching your shoulders, a primal thermal defense strategy. You're trying to decrease your surface area exposed to the wind. The ship's designers couldn't give you a roof, but they gave you a structure that, through its very lightness and flexibility, minimized the penetration of cold water. You're grateful for the tar-soaked woolen sail that is currently unfurled. It's not just catching the wind, it's acting as a giant, incredibly stiff windbreak, forcing the biting gale up and over the ship, hopefully sparing those of you huddled close to the center. It's not much, but it's the beginning of the Viking thermal strategy. Minimize heat loss through design, maximize internal generation through preparation. The preparation, of course, starts with what you're wearing. You are still standing on that deck. The sea spray is relentless, but now you shift your focus from the external design of the ship to the ingenious armor you're wearing your clothes. This, more than any structural element of the Longship, is your primary thermal defense system. Without proper layering, the most expensive oak ship in the world turns into a very fast coffin. The Viking answer to the Arctic freeze wasn't high-tech. It was incredibly practical and almost entirely wool-based. This reliance on wool is a mainstream historical fact often overlooked in favor of swords and shields. You are not wearing a thin cotton shirt. You are enveloped in thick, lanolin, rich wool, probably from the sturdy, smaller-bodied Scandinavian sheep. The key to this wool, and why it saved lives, is its ability to retain heat even when damp. Wool fibers are complex. They are hydrophobic, water, repelling, on the outside due to natural oils, and hydrophilic, water, absorbing, on the inside. This means the surface repels the light rain and spray, but even if the inner layer gets damp from sweat or heavy exposure, the crimped nature of the fibers traps tiny pockets of air. These air pockets are the true insulators, effectively maintaining a warm microclimate around your skin, regardless of the chill outside. Your base layer is likely a loose-fitting tunic, maybe linen, but the bulk of your defense comes from multiple layers of woolen kirtil, tunics, and thick, often cross-gartered broek trousers. Over this, you might have a heavy, hooded cloak, perhaps made from particularly coarse, tightly woven vadmal, a thick, standard woolen cloth that was so valuable it was used as currency in Iceland. You pull the heavy hood tighter around your face, feeling the scratchy wool against your skin. It's not soft, but softness doesn't save lives at sea. But wait, there's another layer, one that speaks directly to the harshness of the environment: leather and seal blubber. This is where the insulation moves from mere warmth to genuine survival gear. Over your wool, you likely wear pieces of heavy leather armor or outer tunics treated with animal fat, perhaps from seals or whales. This is your rain shell. You can feel the slight stickiness and the distinct, oily scent of the fat. This layer, a crucial, quirky tidbit, was not just for water resistance. It also formed a much denser, less permeable barrier against the wind, reducing what sailors call wind chill. While wool handles dampness, the oiled leather prevents the saturation in the first place, ensuring the underlying air pockets remain dry and insulating. Then there are your hands and feet. You wiggle your toes inside thick wool socks and heavy leather boots. The boots, likely lined with fur or padded with straw or moss for insulation, were waterproofed with that same seal blubber. Your gloves, probably thick leather mittens lined with fur, are cumbersome, but they are absolutely essential. Keeping your extremities warm is paramount, as the body pulls heat away from these areas first to protect the core organs. Losing the use of your fingers to cold could mean the difference between properly adjusting a sail and crashing into an iceberg. Historians still argue whether the use of specific animal furs, bear, reindeer, or even fox, was purely a matter of status, or if these different hides were prioritized based on their superior thermal properties for particular climates or roles on the ship. For instance, the heavy, dense undercoat of the Arctic fox might be better for neck coverings, while the thicker, longer hair of a bear hide would be ideal for a sleeping role. Regardless, the entire system relies on trapping the heat you generate. The Longship provides minimal shelter. Your clothes provide the actual home. Think of it this way. Your body is a radiator, and your clothing is a brilliantly designed, multi-layered thermos flask. If you sweat too much because you're rowing hard, you chill quickly as the dampness hits the outer air. If you don't layer enough, the wind strips your heat away instantly. The genius of the Viking system was the flexibility. You could shed a tunic while rowing hard and put on the heavy cloak when resting on watch. It was a constant, conscious effort to manage your personal microclimate, balancing heat generation with minimizing heat loss. It's a subtle form of biothermal engineering, a kind of primitive heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC, system built around animal fibers. You silently thank the sheep for their service. Seriously, next time you see a sheep, just nod respectfully. The cold is an unrelenting parasite, but the solution isn't just external, it's deep inside you. You feel that low, dull burn in your stomach. Not quite hunger yet, but the constant metabolic demand of maintaining your core temperature in this hostile environment. Your body is a furnace, and the only way to keep the flames high is through incredibly rich, energy-dense rations. This, perhaps more than any woolen cloak, is the true engine of Viking survival at sea. This high-fat, high-calorie diet is a mainstream historical fact and the bedrock of their physiological defense. Forget those delicate historical feasts you might imagine. Out here, efficiency is everything. What did you eat this morning? Probably skyer, a thick, yogurt-like dairy product. Perhaps mixed with berries you preserved last fall, but more critically, a significant amount of butter, lard, or tallow. Fats contain more than twice the energy density of carbohydrates or protein. They burn slower, providing a sustained internal heat source like a slow-releasing furnace that keeps your organs humming. You instinctively reach for the small, hard lump of dried meat and fat in your pouch, the texture rough and salty on your tongue. Chewing it slowly releases a flood of energy, a tiny, welcome surge of warmth spreading through your chest. Another dietary staple, particularly vital on these long sea voyages, was dried fish, specifically cod or similar lean, protein-rich fish, often dried into rock-hard hardfisker. It's almost pure protein, which takes more energy for your body to digest, a phenomenon known as the thermic effect of food. While not as quick as fat, this metabolic demand generates more internal heat. You gnaw on a piece of the tough, cured fish, breaking off small chunks. It's flavorless and difficult, but you know this simple act is forcing your body to work to extract the nutrients, and that work equals heat. Now, let's talk about the quirky tidbit of Viking beverages. While we often focus on ale or mead, out here on the icy seas, the most critical drink was often whey or sour milk products. Fresh water was always a finite resource, so they often relied on slightly fermented milk. Not only did these drinks provide necessary calories, but the fermentation process helped preserve them and, crucially, provided essential vitamins that were missing when they couldn't access fresh vegetables for weeks on end. Plus, drinking cold water forces your body to expend energy to warm it up, a waste of precious calories. Consuming liquids closer to body temperature, or even fermented and calorie-rich liquids, was an efficient way to hydrate while minimizing heat loss. You realize that your ancestors' definition of a power smoothie was probably just warm, rancid milk and dried fish. The physical exertion of rowing provides massive, intermittent bursts of heat. You and your fellow oarsmen rotate shifts, and when you are pulling hard against the oar, you are generating so much heat that you must quickly shed layers to avoid sweating. Remember, dampness is doom. The moment you stop rowing, you immediately pull those damp woolen layers back on to trap the residual heat. This constant, careful balancing act between metabolic generation, physical exertion, and rapid clothing adjustment is the Viking thermal strategy in miniature. Historians still argue whether the Vikings intentionally sought out high-protein or high-fat diets purely for thermogenesis, or if it was simply a pragmatic result of their agricultural limitations. After all, they couldn't grow wheat easily, but they had plenty of livestock and excellent fishing grounds. The practical outcome, however, is undeniable. They were consuming a fuel optimized for extreme cold exposure, turning their stomachs into mini braziers. You look at the rough, calloused hands of the man rowing next to you. His face is chapped and red, but he's moving steadily. His survival depends just as much on the slab of salted pork fat he ate hours ago as it does on his own strength. When your external heat sources are nil, you must become ruthlessly efficient at burning fuel internally. And the most efficient way to maximize that internal heat? Share it. You've fed the fire in your belly and you're wrapped in the finest oiled wool, yet the cold still gnaws. Now comes the most basic, yet perhaps most powerful strategy in the Viking thermal arsenal: huddling. This isn't just about sharing space. It's about weaponizing physics and biology. You look around the deck. There are 50 or 60 of you crammed onto a relatively narrow, open vessel. There's barely room to swing an axe, let alone walk comfortably. This intense crowding is not an inconvenience. It is a meticulously managed, non-negotiable part of the survival strategy. Every single man on this ship is radiating heat about 100 watts of thermal energy when resting, and significantly more when rowing. 50 men, at minimum, constitute a 5,000-watt, living, breathing heater. This collective warmth, trapped by the ship's shallow side walls and the heavy canvas tents or temporary shelters strung up on deck, creates a measurable temperature difference from the outside air. This phenomenon, known scientifically as communal thermoregulation, is a mainstream historical fact applied by many species, but the Vikings perfected it on the move. When you aren't rowing, you are encouraged, or perhaps forced by necessity, to lie side by side. You feel the rough texture of the bare hide beneath you and the undeniable warmth radiating from the body pressed against yours. You pull your knees up, interlocking legs and arms with the men around you. This drastically reduces the surface area of each individual exposed to the outside cold, minimizing conductive and convective heat loss. Think of it like a giant, sweaty human blanket. The sheer density of bodies slows the air movement, the number one way heat escapes. Convection, the transfer of heat through air movement, is drastically cut down inside this tight pack. If you tried to recreate this on a modern cruise ship, security would intervene instantly. But here, it's literally life-saving. A quirky tidbit about this crowding. Anthropological studies suggest this forced intimacy likely played a significant role in developing the intense social cohesion and loyalty characteristic of Viking warrior bands. You are, quite literally, depending on your neighbor's body heat for survival. This level of physical reliance forged bonds of trust stronger than any contract. You couldn't afford to alienate the man who might be the only thing standing between you and hypothermia tonight. The heat generated by the collective also serves to slightly raise the dew point inside the temporary shelter, often preventing the formation of excessive frost or ice inside the enclosure, though it certainly encourages a rather pungent atmosphere. This leads to the inherent challenge. You generate moisture through breath and sweat, which must be managed. That's why the thick, oil-rich wool, remember that layering from Section 3, is so important. It absorbs the moisture from the inner body, sweat, while still trapping the heat, only allowing the moisture to slowly dissipate through the outer layers. Historians still argue whether the Vikings practiced a rotational sleeping schedule purely for thermal efficiency, ensuring a perpetually warm core for the group, or if it was simply necessary for standing watch and steering the ship. Regardless of the intent, a few men awake and active, generating heat, meant the mass of sleeping men were kept warmer than if everyone slept simultaneously. You roll over, trying to find a comfortable spot, a tough task when your bedmate is a grizzled warrior and feel the warmth of the wooden plank beneath you. That wood, however, is constantly being cooled by the ocean. In the next section, we'll see how the space beneath the deck, seemingly irrelevant, also played a crucial, if minimal, role in insulation. For now, you just breathe deeply, inhaling the damp, meaty smell of 50 men, and feel the powerful, comforting radiation of the human engine around you. This is the simplest science. The closer you are, the warmer you are. You're now nestled tight in the human cocoon, feeling the small victory of sustained warmth against the icy night. But while the deck seems exposed, what's happening below deck in the often ignored space beneath your feet is providing a minimal yet critical layer of insulation. You shift slightly and feel the slight, subtle movement of the hull as it meets the waves. Beneath the planks you're lying on is the bilge space. This is not a dry, cozy basement. It's the lowest part of the ship, designed to collect the water that inevitably leaks in, either through minor hull gaps or from the spray that drains off the deck. This water is constantly being pumped out, but there's always a certain amount present, sloshing gently with the movement of the sea. This bilge water, perhaps counterintuitively, is your friend. Why is the presence of cold, dark bilge water a thermal strategy? Because the ocean is relentlessly cold, often near freezing. The mass of the water in the bilge space, especially near the centerline, is somewhat insulated from the external sea by the thickness of the lowest hull planks. This trapped bilge water acts as a slight thermal buffer, a massive, albeit temporary, heat sink. While it's cold, it's not as cold as the freezing sea outside, which is constantly pulling heat away through the wood. The bilge water helps to slightly equalize the temperature on the inside of the hull planks, reducing the severity of the temperature gradient that drives heat loss from the ship's interior. This buffering effect is a mainstream historical fact in naval architecture. Any air-filled cavity near the waterline is a potential heat thief. A water-filled cavity, on the other hand, stabilizes the temperature. Another crucial layer beneath you is the ballast. Viking longships, particularly those carrying cargo, needed heavy objects at the bottom to improve stability. This ballast often consisted of large, rounded stones. These stones, resting directly on the hull floor, had a twofold purpose: stability and insulation. They are poor conductors of heat compared to water, and they occupied a significant amount of the bilge space. This dense layer of stone essentially added another physical barrier between the freezing sea and the deck where you are sleeping. A quirky tidbit related to storage. Beneath the deck, alongside the ballast, the Vikings stored perishable items and often supplies that needed to be kept cool, but not frozen solid like butter, cheese, and preserved meats. The metabolic heat from the 50 men on deck was constantly migrating downward. This downward thermal migration, while minimal, could sometimes be just enough to keep crucial supplies from freezing, turning the bottom of the ship into a natural, slightly insulated cold storage area. The preservation of the crew's vital food supply is directly tied to the collective body heat radiating from above. You're heating your dinner, in a way. Try not to think about the bilge rat potential while you're sleeping. Historians still argue whether the placement of the wooden planking removable deck boards, known as sealdur, over the ribs was purely structural for standing divided by rowing, or if their tight fitting also aimed to minimize air circulation between the bilge and the deck space, thereby enhancing the insulating effect of the ballast and bilge water beneath. It's likely both, but the simple act of having a separate, unventilated cavity underneath you is a much better defense against cold than an open-bottom boat. You realize that every part of the ship, from the thick, tarred sail, remember that sail acting as a windbreak from Section 2, to the stones beneath your feet, is being utilized in this grand, organic thermal management system. There is no fire, no single, brilliant invention, just a clever, almost accidental combination of design elements and human body physics working in harmony to slow the inevitable cooling. You take comfort in the density of the stones and the slightly less cold water beneath the floorboards. It's a small consolation, but out here, small things make the difference between a rough night and a deadly one. You are resting, curled up tight with the human radiator next to you, relying on the structural insulation from the ballast below. But let's indulge the desperate fantasy of actual, external heat. On land, the Vikings had hearths. At sea, they had ingenuity, or at least the widespread rumor of it. We now turn to the debated, minimal use of the portable hearth. The key to understanding any external heat source on a wooden boat is the concept of heat retention. You can't build a fire, but what if you could bring the heat from a fire onto the ship? This is where the soapstone bowl or hot rocks come into play. Soapstone or steatite is a remarkable naturally occurring metamorphic rock widely used by the Vikings. It's soft enough to carve easily into cookware, lamps, and, critically, bowls. This is a mainstream historical fact. Archaeological finds show these items were common in Viking settlements. Soapstone has a high specific heat capacity. This means it can absorb a massive amount of thermal energy without its temperature rising excessively quickly, and, more importantly for us, it retains that heat for a very long time. The theory goes, and this is a highly debated point, that before leaving an anchorage or a shore camp, Vikings would heat these thick soapstone vessels, or perhaps simply dense river stones wrapped in damp moss, directly in a roaring fire on land. Once glowing hot, these items would be carefully carried back onto the ship, potentially placed inside a wooden box lined with clay or a layer of damp sand, and then covered with layers of heavy animal hides. The heat radiated from this small, portable core, your makeshift portable hearth, would slowly release warmth into the cramped space of a sleeping area or beneath a wind-breaking canvas tent. It's a primitive thermal battery, offering a few hours of localized, dry, radiant heat. It wouldn't warm the whole deck, not by a long shot, but when you are shivering at 3 a.m., a small, warm stone near your feet might be the difference between sleep and dangerous hypothermia. A quirky tidbit relating to this practice involves their stone lamps. Vikings used small soapstone lamps fueled by seal or whale blubber. While the primary purpose was light and the rank smoke was certainly a negative, the tiny, enclosed flame did generate a minute amount of heat. More significantly, it provided a psychological boost and allowed men to see to manage their gear, preventing the deadly mistake of putting on damp clothes in the dark. The little flame was a promise that not all was frozen. The practicality of carrying and managing these hot rocks is what leads to the intense scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the danger of setting the ship alight and the sheer logistics of fetching and carrying a dozen massive glowing rocks outweighed the limited thermal benefit. It's generally accepted that this practice would only have been viable during short coastal journeys or immediately after leaving a secure port. For a long North Atlantic crossing, the energy required to repeatedly heat the stones would be enormous, and the heat loss would quickly render them useless. It was a luxury of opportunity, not a sustained solution. You imagine the care involved. A man gingerly carrying the heavy, glowing stone, the heat a visible ripple in the cold air, the small hiss as a stray drop of water touches the rock. It's an act of faith, a small, tangible link back to the warmth of land. The reality, however, is that as the voyage stretched into days, these stones would cool and become just more dead weight, more ballast. Remember those stones from Section 6, providing only insulation from below, not warmth from above. You realize that relying on external, retained heat is a fool's errand. The real, reliable source of warmth must be renewable, and that brings us back to the human furnace and how the Vikings maximized its output during the crucial hours of rest. The promise of that warm soapstone quickly fades. You realize the true luxury isn't the rock you brought from land, but the animal hide you brought from home. The sun has dipped entirely now, and the bitter cold has intensified, driving you toward the most important nightly defense, the sleep ritual. This wasn't just about rest. It was a carefully managed thermal operation. Your first move before settling is checking your layers. Remember that layering system from Section 3. If any part of your thick woolen tunic or leggings is wet from the day's spray or exertion, you must attempt to change or reposition it. Sleeping in damp clothes is a fast track to death. Once the clothes are deemed adequate, you enter your bedding, the heavy furs and hide bags. These were not just blankets. They were essential pieces of kit. The primary bedding was often a thick bear, reindeer, or sheep hide. Reindeer hides, in particular, are remarkable insulators, a mainstream historical fact. Their fur is hollow, trapping enormous amounts of air, creating a superior thermal barrier. You slide beneath the rough, heavy weight of the hide, maybe even zipping yourself into a rudimentary sleeping bag fashioned from thick leather or stitched furs. This hide bag acted as an individual micro-shelter, capturing the body heat, that 100-watt radiator from Section 5 you are generating. The setup is not luxurious. You're lying on the deck planks, perhaps with a straw or moss mat beneath you for minimal cushioning and insulation. More on that deck insulation from Section 6. But the real genius lies in the collective napping. You aren't sleeping alone in your bag. You are nestled into the mass of men you huddled with earlier. The human chain of warmth continues into the night. Your quirky tidbit here is the specific arrangement. Vikings likely practiced spooning or interlocking limbs, not for intimacy, but for maximizing surface area contact. By packing yourselves in densely, the total exterior surface area exposed to the cold air, and thus the total area for heat loss, is drastically reduced for the group as a whole. You are reducing heat loss via convection and radiation, simply by touching. Sleep must be broken and fitful. The men on watch need to be rotated, and the inherent discomfort of the cramped, cold, noisy environment ensures you never truly enter a deep, restful state. This fragmented sleep actually contributes to heat management. During deep sleep, the body's metabolic rate drops, reducing heat production. By only achieving light sleep, you maintain a slightly higher metabolic furnace, preventing a drastic drop in core temperature. It's a cruel, involuntary survival mechanism. Historians still argue whether the use of personal, thick woolen cloaks, like the falda, that could double as specialized sleeping bags, was a later, more sophisticated invention, or if it was common from the earliest voyages. Regardless, the intent was the same: create a personal, sealed environment to trap the heat. You settle into the rough fur, pulling the oily, thick material tight around your chin. You can hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man next to you, a comforting, warm sound. You think about how easily you could drift into a hypothermic sleep, and how much discipline it takes to stay aware, to remember to shift your body, to keep that circulation going. You briefly recall the warm, steamy saunas you left behind on shore, a place where warmth was not a fight but a reward. You promise yourself you'll go straight to the badstofer the moment you hit land, even if you have to fight a bear for a spot. The memory, however fleeting, provides a psychological anchor, and that brings us to the importance of heat before you even board the ship. You pull the rough fur tighter, the scent of sea salt and damp wool strong in your nostrils. Your muscles ache from the day's rowing, and you yearn for a deep, penetrating heat that the human huddle, remember that intense communal warmth from Section 5, just can't provide. This is where we step back to land for a moment and look at the Viking cultural secret weapon against the cold, the sauna. The Viking sauna, or badstofer in Old Norse, was a ubiquitous feature of Scandinavian life, a mainstream historical fact. It wasn't just for cleaning. It was a deeply ingrained social and cultural ritual and, critically, a thermal preparation for life in the cold. A typical badstofer was a small, tightly built wooden structure, often dug partially into the earth for extra insulation. Inside, water was thrown onto superheated stones, not unlike the portable rocks we discussed in Section 7, but much, much bigger, creating intense, humid heat and steam. Spending time in the blistering heat of the badstofer served several crucial functions before embarking on a cold voyage. First, it provided a massive physiological heat load. By soaking up intense heat for a long period, your body's core temperature actually rises slightly above its normal set point. When you finally step out into the cold air and onto the ship, your body takes much longer to cool down, effectively giving you a thermal head start that could last for hours. It's like pre-charging your battery. Second, the intense heat triggered heavy sweating. While this might seem counterproductive, remember that dampness is doom. The controlled environment of the sauna allowed you to sweat out toxins and, more importantly, reset your thermal management system. You washed off the salty residue of past days and prepared your skin to be covered by the thick, oiled layers. A clean body, wrapped in clean, dry layers, is infinitely better at regulating temperature. The quirky tidbit here is that the Vikings often combined the sauna with an immediate, terrifying plunge into icy water or snow, a practice known as isbading. This shock therapy was believed to harden the body and mind, harker, more on that in a later section, and improve circulation. While a modern doctor might advise caution, this ritual trained the body's vascular system to rapidly constrict surface blood vessels when exposed to cold, a key physiological defense against hypothermia. You're teaching your body how to be cold efficient before the ship even leaves the harbour. The memory of the steam and the burning wood is a powerful psychological anchor out here on the cold, exposed deck. The saunas represented warmth, home, and survival. It was a tangible preparation for the endurance test ahead. Historians still argue whether the high cultural value placed on the sauna was primarily for hygiene, or if its therapeutic benefits in preparing the body for the chronic cold of North Atlantic life was the main driver. Regardless, the effect was physical and mental conditioning. You realize this is why the Vikings could tolerate conditions that would fell a modern sailor within minutes. They didn't just endure the cold, they prepared for it on a fundamental, cellular level. They knew the ship wouldn't heat them, so they had to arrive preheated and conditioned for deprivation. And now that you are on the sea, the environment itself, specifically the sails, offers a secondary, crucial defense against the wind's thermal theft. You are back on the ship. The memory of the searing badstofer heat. Remember that thermal pre-charge from Section 9? a distant, cruel joke compared to the biting wind now ripping across the deck. We've covered the body, the food, and the internal design. Now, let's look up at the sails and tar, two elements critical to Viking navigation, which also provided an unexpected, massive thermal defense. The enormous square sail, typically made of heavy, coarse wool, is a mainstream historical fact, often overshadowed by the sleek design of the ship itself. This wasn't modern, lightweight canvas. This wool was incredibly dense, tightly woven, and most importantly, saturated with a mixture of animal fat and wood tar. This tarring served two main purposes. Functionally, it helped preserve the wool, preventing rot and protecting it from mildew in the damp sea air. Thermally, however, it turned the sail into a giant, flexible shield against heat loss. The tar made the sail highly water-resistant, or at least slowed water absorption, and, by adding weight and density, drastically reduced its permeability to wind. When the sail is set, it's not just catching the wind. It's creating a massive wind shadow that shelters a significant portion of the crew and the open deck space. The wind is the number one thief of heat via convection, stripping away the thin layer of warm air the crew's bodies and clothing, Section 3, are trying to maintain. A thick, tarred sail forces the wind to divert high over the ship, providing a relatively calm pocket below. This small drop in wind speed in the sleeping area can make a difference equivalent to several degrees Celsius, which is absolutely vital when facing hypothermia. The tar was also applied liberally to the exterior of the hull planks, Section 2. This application created a smoother, more water-resistant surface. Water running down the hull slipped off faster, meaning the wood stayed less saturated and therefore a slightly better insulator. It also helped to fill those tiny seams where the clinker planks overlapped, preventing the ingress of cold seawater. It seems tar was the Viking version of duct tape, used for everything, always available and slightly smelly. A quirky tidbit about the tar itself. The best quality tar was often made by slowly heating pine wood in pits or kilns, a laborious and smoky process. The specific resin content in pine tar made it an excellent sealant. Sailors quickly learned to identify good tar from poor tar, as a faulty batch could lead to rapid deterioration of the sails and hull or, in our context, a rapid increase in heat loss. The quality of your tar was directly linked to your chance of surviving a cold voyage. When the sails were dropped at night or when the wind died down, they weren't simply bundled up. They were often draped over the deck as temporary canvas shelters or tents, supported by the mast and beams. The heavy, tarred wool then acted as a superior thermal blanket, trapping the communal body heat, Section 5, inside, while continuing to block convective heat loss from the top and sides. They became a kind of heavy, mobile, geodesic dome of warmth. Historians still argue whether the distinct red-brown colour of many reconstructed Viking sails, a result of the tarring process, was simply an aesthetic choice, or if the specific pigment helped absorb solar radiation on clearer days, providing a minuscule, but potentially helpful, boost of radiant heat to the exposed crew. While the latter is a long shot, every tiny thermal gain was precious. The sail, therefore, was a multifunctional piece of thermal engineering, a propulsion device, a wind shield, and a heavy, insulating roof. It's another subtle reminder that the Vikings treated the entire ship as a system of survival. But all the practical measures in the world mean nothing without the final, unquantifiable defense, the Viking mindset. The fierce wind still presses against the tarred sail above you. Remember that massive wind-blocking shield from Section 10. But the physical discomfort is constant. You are cold. You are perpetually damp. You are tired. This is where the last, crucial piece of the Viking thermal defense comes into play. Mind over matter. The physical ability to endure this suffering was not just accidental. It was cultivated through a cultural process known as haka. Haka is an Old Norse concept that transcends mere physical toughness. It means hardening, endurance, and fortitude, a deliberate cultural program of exposure and psychological training. This is a mainstream historical fact, often linked to the exceptional military and exploratory successes of the Vikings. They didn't just tolerate the cold, they trained their minds and bodies to operate efficiently within it. You look at the grizzled captain steering the ship. He's standing mostly exposed, facing the wind, his leather gear slick with freezing spray. His posture suggests not comfort, but a total acceptance of the environment. His body is simply a tool that must function, regardless of the discomfort signals his brain is sending. This training often began in childhood, involving exposure to cold water and meager shelter, preparing the Viking from a young age to view extreme conditions not as a threat to be avoided, but as a challenge to be mastered. The psychological impact of haka on thermal management is profound. When a modern, untrained person feels intense cold, their reaction is often panic, which triggers rapid, shallow breathing, muscle tension, and inefficient blood flow, all reactions that waste precious metabolic energy, Section 4, and accelerate heat loss. The hardened Viking, however, remains calm. This composure helps maintain consistent blood flow and allows the body to implement its natural, localized defenses, like shivering, which is an efficient, targeted heat-generating process, and peripheral vasoconstriction, pulling blood away from the skin to protect the core without going into panic overdrive. A quirky tidbit about this conditioning involves the concept of the berserker or bare shirt warrior. While often associated with drug-induced frenzies, the core of the berserker mythology is their apparent invulnerability to pain, including cold. Some theories suggest their intense physical and psychological preparation allowed them to enter a semi-hypnotic state where the body's pain and cold signals were suppressed. While you're certainly not in a frenzy, your own disciplined acceptance of the cold is a miniature version of this mindset. Historians still argue whether the high cultural emphasis on fate word among Vikings contributed to this acceptance of hardship. If you believe your fate is already decided, you are less likely to fear or panic over an immediate threat like the cold, allowing you to focus calmly on practical survival measures. This mental fortitude prevented the psychological spiral that can quickly lead to hypothermia in untrained individuals. You take a deep breath, inhaling the sharp metallic air. You deliberately relax your shoulders, letting go of the tension the cold creates. You acknowledge the icy wetness on your face, but you don't fight it. You know that fear wastes energy, and out here, every calorie must go toward fueling your internal furnace. This isn't just a trip, it's a constant, low-grade thermal war, and your mind is your greatest weapon. A bit of self-help, mixed with extreme exposure, the original Scandinavian survival guide. You need to focus on the next big problem, though. The enemy that is constantly sucking the life out of your insulating layers. You've mastered your mind, haka, the fortitude from Section 11, but no amount of mental toughness can defy the physics of freezing water. The most deceptive and persistent threat to your warmth isn't the cold air. It's the constant presence of fresh water and ice, which acts as a ruthless heat thief. Water, as a mainstream historical fact understood even by ancient sailors, possesses a much higher thermal conductivity than air or wool. This means that if your clothing gets wet, it instantly and dramatically accelerates the rate at which heat leaves your body. Your beautifully layered woolen tunic, Section 3, is a brilliant insulator when dry, because the fibers trap millions of tiny air pockets. When those air pockets fill with water either from freezing spray, rain, or melting ice, the insulation value plummets. The water displaces the air, creating a direct conductive bridge for your body heat to escape into the environment. You watch the oarsman trying to clear the layer of ice that's begun to form on the gunwales. The spray that hits the ship instantly turns into rime ice. This ice formation, while visually dramatic, is also dangerously heavy and must be constantly managed. More importantly, the action of chipping it away or moving through it inevitably leads to dampness. A glove brushes against the ice, and a moment later, the glove is wet. That wetness quickly turns into a localized cold spot, pulling heat from your hand toward the ice's freezing point. This is where the Viking mastery of water repellency became paramount. The copious use of tar and animal fats on sails, ropes, and clothing, Section 10, was primarily a defense against this liquid enemy. Every layer was designed to shed water as quickly as possible. The heavy, oily wool resisted initial saturation, and the tight weave ensured that water beaded on the surface rather than soaking in immediately. A quirky tidbit relating to this is the management of the deck itself. Historians believe that the Vikings often utilized loose pieces of wood or rough mats made of woven reeds or animal sinew placed over the deck planks. Remember that planking and ballast below from Section 6. These weren't for comfort. They were designed to create a small air gap between your bedding, Section 8, and the perpetually cold, often damp deck surface. This air gap, however thin, slowed the conductive heat loss from your body to the wood, further preventing your furs from drawing moisture directly from the deck. It was a simple, yet effective, barrier against cold, wet wood. The irony is that to survive, you must stay hydrated, Section 4, but the water all around you is lethal. You instinctively know that if you get soaked to the skin, say, by a large wave breaking over the ship, your chances of making it through the night drop precipitously. Your companions would immediately strip you, dry you with spare furs, and surround you with their body heat, knowing that quick action is the only defense against the rapidly progressing hypothermia. Historians still argue whether the Vikings brought specialized tools for collecting and managing fresh water that were designed to prevent freezing, or if they relied solely on collecting rainwater divided by meltwater and storing it in large, heavy casks that, due to their mass and insulation from being stored below deck, resisted freezing. Whatever the method, managing drinkable water was a constant logistical nightmare, contrasting sharply with the overwhelming, lethal abundance of salt water all around. You watch the water spray turning to a thin sheet of ice on the ropes. You pull your collar higher, trying to block the fine mist. You know the best defense is simply avoiding contact with the water, or, failing that, ensuring your layers are so well oiled they act as a slippery, impenetrable barrier. But what about the one form of heat that seems most obvious on a ship cooking? The brutal truth is that a fire is a hungry, dangerous thing on a wooden boat, especially one smeared with flammable tar. Remember that tarred wool from Section 10. This brings us to the limited and often misunderstood role of the cook's role at sea. The minimal heat generated by cooking was a tool for morale, not a primary source of thermal energy. The idea that Vikings had a roaring galley fire to keep the ship warm is a myth. The danger of an open flame combined with the movement of the waves made sustained cooking fires on long voyages virtually impossible. The longships were simply too shallow and too open. However, small enclosed hearths, like the ceramic or stone-lined boxes found on some archaeological examples, a mainstream historical fact, were used, but almost exclusively when the ship was anchored securely on shore, or maybe nestled in a quiet fjord for the night. They were designed for cooking, not for heating the entire crew on the open ocean. So, during the days or weeks of hard sailing, the vast majority of your rations, like the dried fish and fat from Section 4, were consumed cold or raw. You relied on your internal metabolic furnace to burn that energy. The few times the hearth was lit on shore, it was a massive psychological event. Eating a small portion of warm cooked porridge or boiled meat provided a powerful boost to morale. Warm food expands blood vessels and gives an immediate, satisfying rush of internal heat that is disproportionate to the actual calories consumed. It's a psychological weapon against the crushing cold. A quirky tidbit about cooking involves the potential use of pre-cooked, preserved ingredients. To save time and fuel on land, Vikings often prepared food that required minimal reheating, such as pottage, a thick stew, made from grains and meat, which was then salted and stored. A small amount of this cold, highly calorific mix could be warmed slightly with hot water from a small, closed pot heated over a tiny shielded flame, if conditions allowed, just enough to break the chill and aid digestion. This was not a roaring fire. It was a carefully managed, small pocket of heat for a single pot. The Viking version of heat and eat was probably less about heating and more about just eating. The captain, or the designated cook-cocker, was therefore tasked less with providing hot meals and more with rationing and preparation. Their primary job was ensuring the food stores, Section 6, were protected from rot, pests, and freezing, and distributing the dry, energy-dense food fairly. This task was vital to maintaining the crew's internal heat source, which was far more effective than any small external fire. Historians still argue whether the practice of carrying embers in clay-lined boxes, as distinct from the hot stones for heat, was common for the purpose of rapidly igniting a fire upon beaching, or if they relied solely on fire-starting kits. The logistics of keeping embers alive for days at sea are formidable, but it speaks to the high value placed on the ability to generate a fire, even if that heat was strictly reserved for land. You understand now that any heat generated by cooking was fleeting, localized, and a risky endeavor. Your continuous warmth must come from your thick wool layers, your huddling shipmates, and the fats and proteins you ate this morning. The true lesson is recognizing the limitation of external heat sources on the Longship, which leads us to the final debunking of a popular romantic notion, the idea of cozy, enclosed living quarters at sea. You've learned that the Longship is a beautifully efficient machine for travel, not a cozy winter lodge. Yet, when people imagine Vikings sailing, they often picture them retreating into small, enclosed spaces, safe from the spray, a romanticized image we must now address. The myth of the Hoos, or the permanent enclosed cabin. The reality, supported by the archaeological evidence from major finds like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, is that Viking longships, especially those used for warfare and long-distance exploration, were almost entirely open-deck vessels. This is a mainstream historical fact. The ships were designed for speed, a large rowing crew, and the ability to beach quickly. Any permanent, fully enclosed structure would have added dangerous top heaviness, reduced stability, and taken up space needed for warriors, rowers, and crucial gear. The few remnants or suggestions of structures on deck point not to permanent cabins but to temporary, demountable canvas tents, often called tejald, that could be quickly erected when anchored or in calm seas for overnight rest. These tents were generally supported by the mast and specific deck beams. While they offered a vital shield against the wind and spray, remember the tarred wool from Section 10 acting as a roof, they were not insulated cabins in the modern sense. They were thin, drafty canvas shells, only useful because they trapped the communal body heat, Section 5, generated by the mass of men huddled beneath them. A quirky tidbit relating to this is the existence of the lifting. This was the small, raised area at the stern, often used for steering, where the ship's master or captain would stand. While slightly more sheltered than the open mid-deck, it certainly wasn't a cabin. The captain's elevated position gave him a clear view and perhaps a slightly drier spot to sleep, but it was still essentially open to the elements. The slight advantage of the lifting was not its warmth, but its dryness, the ultimate thermal luxury at sea, Section 12. Historians still argue whether the practice of utilizing cargo sacks of grain, bales of furs, or chests as impromptu windbreaks and barriers was a standardized thermal practice or simply a necessity of cargo management. Regardless, these supplies, layered on the deck, would have created small, segmented areas of relative calm, offering a slight reduction in wind chill, reinforcing the Viking principle of leveraging every available resource for survival. The debunking of the enclosed cabin myth reinforces the main thesis. The Vikings succeeded not through architectural ingenuity in heating the ship, but through personal, metabolic, and collective thermal discipline. There was no central heating system. Their heat was distributed, portable, and fiercely defended. They made the best of an inherently cold and uncomfortable environment by treating their clothing, their food, their shipmates, and their minds as the only furnace they needed. You look around the deck for the last time. You see the cold, wet reality of the ship, the low sides, the open space, the lack of any chimney or stovepipe. You realize that you are the warmth. And now, as the voyage nears its end, you need to synthesize all these disparate strategies into one holistic, powerful image of Viking endurance. The relentless motion of the sea has finally begun to soften. You feel the ship slowing, the violent slap of the waves diminishing into a gentler lull. You look toward the horizon and see the faint, dark outline of land, your destination. This final reprieve allows you to synthesize the entire, magnificent system that brought you here alive. This is the synthesis of all warmth strategies, revealing that the Vikings did not heat their ships. They simply stopped the cold from winning. Their survival was not due to a single invention, but a comprehensive, layered system of thermal defense that addressed every vector of heat loss. Conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction control, heat loss to touch. This was managed by minimizing contact with the ultimate heat thief, the freezing sea. The shallow, draft, clinker-built hull, Section 2, and the ballast stones and bilge water, Section 6. Beneath the deck planks were crucial in slowing the heat exchange from the wooden structure to the water. On a personal level, thick furs and straw mats, Section 8, Section 12, were used to create insulating air gaps between your body and the cold wood of the deck. Convection control, heat loss to wind. This was the most vicious enemy at sea. Convection was blocked by the massive tarred wool sail, section 10, which acted as a towering windbreak, creating a pocket of relative calm on the deck. When anchored, this sail became the roof of the temporary shelter, jawled, section 14, trapping the heat. On a personal level, the dense, oily vadmal wool, section 3, acted as a windproof barrier, reducing airflow right against the skin. Radiation control, heat loss to the environment. This was countered entirely by communal warmth, section 5. By huddling the entire crew together in dense, interlocking arrangements, section 8, the Vikings drastically reduced the total exposed surface area of the heating system, ensuring that the 5,000 watts of collective human energy was radiated into the small, enclosed space, rather than escaping into the vast, cold atmosphere. This layered approach was powered by the constant, renewable fuel of the Viking Metabolic Furnace, section 4, the high-fat, high-calorie diet that provided the sustained energy needed just to maintain core temperature. This physical engine was then supported by the psychological discipline of Haka, section 11, the fortitude that prevented panic and the wasteful expenditure of energy, ensuring that every movement was deliberate and focused on survival. You now see the Longship not as a single piece of wood, but as an elegant, integrated system where the ship's design, the crew's clothing, their diet, their social habits, and their mindset all worked in seamless, thermal concert. There was no single, elegant solution like a stove. There was 1,000 necessary, messy, and collective adjustments. The simple fact is that the few historical attempts to use fire for heating at sea, like the minimal use of soapstone section 7, were either too dangerous or too inefficient for long voyages. The ultimate thermal technology was the human body itself. Historians still argue whether the success of Viking colonization in places like Greenland was more a testament to their superior maritime skills or their absolute mastery of cold weather endurance systems, the very system that brought you safely across this unforgiving sea. The answer, likely, is that you cannot separate the two. The ship allowed the journey, and the survival system allowed the men to complete it. You feel the ship gently turn toward the shore. The waves that once seemed like crushing enemies are now just rhythmic bumps. The wind, once a thief, now merely smells of approaching land. You survived because you were never truly alone, and you were never truly unprepared. The cold demanded everything, and the Vikings gave it everything except their lives. The movement stops. A profound stillness settles over the ship, a blessed quiet replacing the incessant noise of the sea. You allow yourself to sink back onto the rough furs, feeling the tension drain out of your shoulders, your feet, your very core. The cold is still present, a ghost against your skin, but it no longer holds any terror. It is simply a sensation, one that will soon be replaced by the warmth of a fire on the beach, the kind of heat that is easy and safe. Breathe deeply. Inhale the lingering scent of tar, salt, and dense wool. Exhale the exhaustion of the journey. The hard part is over. Your body, weary but resilient, is already beginning to relax its fierce hold on your core temperature. You don't need to huddle, or worry, or even think about the next meal. You are safe. You are warm enough. Let the last vivid image be the gentle lapping of the water against the hull, a soft, comforting sound. The ship, which carried you through the frozen night, is finally resting. You can rest too. Let the darkness take the harsh edges from your sight, and let the quiet take the worry from your mind. There is only the rhythm of your own slow, deep breathing now. Sleep comes easily tonight.